The national topic is upon us. Although it was chosen by mere hair, the topic received 50% of both the coach and the student vote. This may be my favorite topic yet. As many of you know, I spent 5 years, easily the best 5 years of my life, living on the Isle Formosa, Taiwan. It remains close to my heart, and my love for Taiwan is echoed in the words of nearly every foreigner who spends time there. The decision to leave Taiwan last August was complex and bittersweet, but I can't say the political instability wasn't a factor. How much more time do I want to invest in a life that's potentially doomed? Sadly, it's not exclusively a personal anxiety. I have a number of friends who have left Taiwan in recent years with similar thoughts. Yet, as the looming threat of a Chinese invasion grows, America's commitments to Taiwan, overt and otherwise, grow in measure. Thucydides's trap is baited, and with both actors pressing their hands, it feels increasingly certain that our future is predetermined. And even if the trap is not sprung, values like democracy and economic freedom are indeed in the balance. So, our present topic places yet another weight on the scale. A feather or a brick, that's up for debate, but a weight nonetheless. And whether the pride of winning this fight or the horror of having no fight at all wins out, well, that's what this topic is all about. Starting, as always, on the resolution. Resolved, the United States should establish a comprehensive, bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. As usual, let's take those words one by one. Despite the fact that USFG is often used in debate resolutions, US federal government, here we simply find the United States. Indeed, the difference between state and federal legislation often is crucial, especially in areas of domestic law. However, for this resolution, there's not much room for confusion. It's only the federal government that can establish trade agreements with other countries. The big catch here is Taiwan a country? As usual, impacts that are good for the US are usually good for Pro. The concerns of Taiwan are secondary. While it's great to help an ally, the US should ultimately do things that are good for the US. Although, of course, that's debatable. Next, establish. Establish isn't the same thing as acting out. There may be cases in this debate where establishing a trade agreement without necessarily achieving any great amount could still be beneficial or harmful. In fact, these will be the high magnitude contentions. How does simply establishing a trade agreement or not send strong signals to China and beyond? Comprehensive. This means everything, or at least many things. A trade agreement that is comprehensive may be aimed at changing the basic structure of relationships between the two countries. Quote, comprehensive economic and trade agreements are aimed at influencing global norms and standards, not just at making melons or car parts cheaper. Bilateral. A bilateral deal is, of course, between the two countries, and only between the two countries. Multilateral trade agreements between 3 or more countries also exist, like USMCA, Trump's replacement to NAFTA, between Canada, the US, and Mexico. Trade agreement. There are many types of trade agreements. Most commonly in the literature, a free trade agreement, or FTA, is one that removes some or all barriers to trade between, for bilateral agreements between two countries. This resolution doesn't mention free trade agreements specifically, although most of the debate will likely take place on these FTAs. The other common type of argument is preferential trade agreements, which are usually unilateral. For the purpose of clarity, I'll refer to the US-Taiwan agreement as a BTA, or bilateral trade agreement, and talk about free trade separately. Although again, for the most part, the ideas will be very similar. In this debate, Pro needs to show that a US-Taiwan BTA would be good. Here, there are two major categories of arguments: economics and geopolitics. Pro can argue both that this BTA will make money and jobs for the US and Taiwan, and that it will increase the US diplomatic power or serve to spread US values like democracy. There are, of course, other arguments that don't fall in this binary. Now, pros should be careful to explore some concrete possibilities about how this could work. For example, former ambassador to Singapore, Frank Lavin, proposes several criteria for a successful US-Taiwan BTA, including making it full spectrum and digital and acting as a model for other agreements. Importantly, though, he also says it should be only part of a broader initiative, perhaps with other countries, which might run afoul of topicality. Pro, in other words, must prepare to defend not just a trade agreement, but a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. Like Pro, there are two major ways Khan will talk about a US-Taiwan BTA being bad. First, it may be bad economically, for example, by hurting American workers. Second, it may be bad geopolitically, for example, by increasing tensions with China. The definitions we've just gone over will also be useful for Khan. Pro may lose on technical grounds if Khan can simply show that, while a trade agreement may be beneficial, a comprehensive trade agreement, as opposed to a more minor agreement, would not. Or if it can show that while a multilateral trade agreement is advisable, a bilateral one is not. This definitions debate may seem tedious, cheap, or worse to many people. And look, it probably is. However, given the surfeit of fantastic pro evidence and the relative lack of con evidence, con teams may want to look a bit outside the box for offense that can really stick. Next, on to background. It is a big pet peeve of mine that every video about Taiwan needs to start with a Taiwan-China history. Like, I've heard this history a million times. I don't need it to understand your travel blog. But with the understanding that most of you haven't lived in Taiwan for 5 years, given that it is a bit confusing, and given that this is a fairly substantial lecture, I should probably give you something, right? So, here's a very short history of the relationship between these three countries. China had a civil war from 1927 to 1949. The emergent communists, inspired by the Russian communists, fought to bring down the national government, called the Nationalists. There was an overlapping war in China with Japan from 1937 to 1945. The national government did most of the fighting with Japan, and weakened from this protracted conflict, the nationalists eventually lost to the communists and were driven out of China in an event known as the Great Retreat. Where did they go? You guessed it, the island of Taiwan. As you may remember from the last topic, Taiwan had recently been freed from Japanese rule and was at the time under the rule of the Chinese national government. Ever since, they've ruled the Republic of China in Taiwan, while the communists set up the People's Republic of China in, well, China. There, the Chinese Communist Party currently rules and is usually referred to as the CCP. The US and many of its allies, including the UN, formally recognized the Republic of China, Taiwan, as the legitimate Chinese government until 1971, when recognition switched in the UN to the People's Republic of China, the communist government in Beijing. Over time, when countries have been faced with the choice of whether to back an exiled government on a small island or the vast wealth of people and land and resources of mainland China, well, it's been a pretty easy choice. And for any countries that think they can just support both, well, let's say Beijing has a different point of view. Taiwan now has only a small and still dwindling list of countries that officially recognize its legitimacy. Nevertheless, the US has continued to support Taiwan and rage in various ways against communists ever since. And the communists have, of course, never fought the oppressive or forgiven the oppressive nationalist regime that sought their extinction for decades. and for historical, political, military, strategic, and imperialist reasons have always strove to regain control over Taiwan, where 95% of people, much like 94% of mainland Chinese, are ethnically Han. Here's a question. Why restrict trade? Why would Taiwan or the US or any countries set up restrictions in the first place that might be dismantled by a trade agreement? Relatedly, why is free trade, or having no trade restrictions, not always the best system? The first reason is competition. If you allow cheap sneakers into your country, your local sneaker manufacturers won't make any money. This can lead to economic decline and job loss. In these cases, you might charge a tariff or a trade tax to anyone wanting to import sneakers into your country, thus making money for the government while raising sneaker prices to more closely match the local market. The second reason is safety and quality. Although customers might demand the cheap sneakers, if they're lined with uranium and giving your people foot cancer, or if food is contaminated or cars fail to meet emission standards, you can't have them imported to your country. Another reason is national security. If you suspect your enemies of hiding spy chips in imported sneakers or spy software in imported cell phones, you might restrict their import to protect the leaking of data and information. A final reason for trade restrictions may be political. If another country insults your national cuisine, you may limit or tax sneaker imports as retaliation. Retaliatory tariffs are often levied during trade disputes, and a tit-for-tat exchange can lead to trade wars, such as the high-profile US and China trade war that Trump began in 2018. Trade restrictions can be put in place for other reasons as well, like some products are illegal in some countries and not illegal in others, but these are the major reasons to look out for. So then, what is a trade agreement? A trade agreement may be any law or framework that reduces or eliminates the tariffs or other trade barriers that were previously enacted. Next, the state of US-Taiwan trade. The US and Taiwan have strong trade relations, valuing about $100 billion per year, with the US exporting about $40 billion of goods and services and importing about $60 billion. That's USTR. The main US imports from Taiwan are machinery, fuels, medical instruments, and aircraft, and the main US exports to Taiwan are machinery, vehicles, iron and steel products, and plastics. However, some trade barriers do exist. Here is Sachs and Hillman quoting information from the U.S. Trade Representative. Quote, USTR has identified remaining issues that could be addressed during negotiations, namely Taiwan's barriers on agricultural products, in particular rice, genetically modified foods, ground beef, and animal byproducts. USTR likely would also push Taiwan to lower tariffs on distilled spirits, large motorcycles, and soda ash, and create a more level playing field in the pharmaceutical and medical device sectors. There is also scope for Taiwan to more effectively combat copyright infringement, especially with respect to online piracy, and to provide greater access to its cloud computing market. Progress on these issues should be attainable. That's Saxon-Hillman 21. Perhaps the most famous trade barrier between the US and Taiwan in recent years has been pork. Taiwan has refused to buy pork containing ractopamine, a food additive commonly added in the US that enhances leanness in meat, which is nevertheless banned in over 150 countries, including the EU, China, and Russia. Given the unwanted strain it caused in US-Taiwan trade relations, the government of Taiwan legalized imports of ractopamine-laced US meat last year, despite public backlash. However, the Taiwan public approved the imports in a referendum last year. Still, quote, given the cultural and religious factors, the complexity of the pork import issue in Taiwan will not be easily resolved. That's Rigger et al. 17. This issue is currently being debated in Taiwan's constitutional court. Next are arguments. And we'll start on pro. The U.S. should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. A U.S.-Taiwan BTA would help both countries' economies, give the U.S. more secure access to Taiwan's semiconductor industry, and give the U.S. additional geopolitical benefits. Our first and most direct argument is economics. Taiwan is the U.S.'s 9th largest trading partner. A free trade agreement would formalize and stabilize much of the trade. After all, without an agreement, trade and tariffs are more subject to the whims of the global economy and whichever political party rules the U.S. and Taiwan at the time. Such an agreement would bring many benefits. Increased trade by billions, that's Smith et al. 22. Giving the U.S. trade options over China, same author. Increased manufacturing investments in the U.S., Rigor 17. It rewards Taiwan free market policies. And here's a quote from Jones 21. Expediting the negotiation of a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan is an economically and strategically sound way to reward and express solidarity with a like-minded ally. Some particular economic benefits include innovation. Increased trade between the U.S. and Taiwan spurs innovation. Bilateral trade is, in general, associated with increased innovation. That's Ezelin foot 19. But the specific case of a U.S.-Taiwan BTA has the added benefit of strong intellectual property protections combined with a world-class IT sector, meaning the U.S. innovation in 5G, IoT, and other tech necessitating high levels of security could take place in Taiwan. Here is Blumenthal and Maza 19. Quote, Taiwan could act as a testbed for 5G and IoT deployment, but an FTA with high digital economy standards would have to be in place for Taiwan and the U.S. to take full advantage of that potential. Importantly, Taiwan acts as an alternative to China here, which doesn't share the Western world's concept of intellectual property rights. Here's Cropsey 20. Quote, a bilateral trade agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan would be a major step forward in ending the U.S.'s dependence on China for vital strategic goods. Protections for U.S. intellectual property that do not exist in China would be honored and enforced in Taiwan. Next, trade itself. Aside from the specific case of the U.S. and Taiwan, free trade is generally a good thing, and a BTA would increase many of the benefits we get from opening up trade. Lincecum and Obregon 22 list many benefits to free trade, including helping both businesses and communities and individuals, promoting peace and cooperation, and enriching and empowering women and children. Trade with other countries also helps U.S. firms. Again, from Ezelin foot 19, quote, evidence shows that countries with many firms that engage with foreign firms in close-knit production processes have much higher productivity than countries whose firms do not. Lastly, trade with Taiwan may actually help, rather than hurt, U.S. trade with China. From Shen 14, quote, Taiwan will also be an ideal springboard as a gateway to the greater China market, given its geographical proximity, cultural similarity, unique access, and special knowledge vis-a-vis mainland China. Let's next dive into answers. But as usual, I invite you to pause the video to come up with your own answers. Only the next two contentions will include this answer section, so make a good use of it. The rest I will leave to you. Remember, we're looking for direct answers and impact mitigation. Ways to say that either these economic arguments are not true, or that these economic arguments are not important, or less important than Pro might say. We're not looking for con arguments that outweigh economics. Economics is going to be one of the main stock contentions for this topic on both pro and con, so it's worth being prepared for it. So, Taiwan is simply small compared to the U.S. The U.S. has about 14 times more people than Taiwan, and its economy is 34 times larger. Any economic benefits that we'll get from a free trade agreement would therefore be small. From McDaniel and Zhong 21, quote, the estimated potential gains of the agreements that have been enacted are just a fraction of 1% of GDP. The US economy is large, trade is still only about 1/4 of GDP, and most remaining tariffs are small. In addition, the impact on the US, most of the goods imported from Taiwan aren't actually from Taiwan originally, but instead are processed through Taiwan from other countries. In fact, less than 20% of imports to the US from Taiwan really add direct value to the US. Again, as in foot 19. Korea is a good counterpoint. As opposed to Taiwan, Korea is more of a hub for value creation and value demand, with goods manufactured in Korea adding significant value to the US economy. Next, for pro, semiconductors. The true competitive value proposition of Taiwan, where 90% of sub-10 nanometer chips, the world's most advanced chips, are manufactured. Ezel and Foot 19 have this to say about Taiwan's importance to the industry. Quote, Taiwan's role as a provider of key, competitively priced inputs and components is essential to a variety of U.S. high-tech industries ranging from information and communications technology to automotive and aerospace to heavy machinery and other advanced manufacturing industries. Therefore, the loss of access, end quote, Therefore, the loss of access to Taiwan by either the US or China could decimate their high-tech economies and, by extension, much of the rest of their economy. Additionally, this importance of Taiwan to the US will only increase over time. So, how can a BTA help? Access to Taiwan semiconductors is hardly guaranteed. A BTA between the two countries and the U.S. commitment to Taiwan that it represents could serve to stabilize the industry. From Shu 22, quote, now is the optimal time for the U.S. to accelerate bilateral trade agreement talks with Taiwan. Such collaboration would emphasize resilience, robustness, and effectiveness in technology, intellectual property protection, enhanced manufacturing capability, investing in growing and upgrading the workforce, better coordination of global supply chain management, cross-sector investment, and overall integration. End quote. Next, semiconductor security. Taiwan's experience with Chinese cyber exploits makes it a key partner, as the island proactively keeps Chinese hackers and government spy technology away from its shores and products. From Lee 21, quote, with its special awareness of Chinese security threats, Taiwan has already excluded Chinese firms from its 4G wireless infrastructure in 2014, previewing the US and other governments' concerns about Huawei and 5G by several years. Then, under President Tsai Ing-wen's leadership, Taiwan's government declared cybersecurity is national security and continued to direct resources, draft legislation, and formulate policies to strengthen the general cybersecurity ecosystem of the island. It's Lee 21. Blumenthal and Maza 19 give further recommendations. Quote, together, the US and Taiwan should convene a high-level 5G/IoT working group. Taiwan has a very strong hardware manufacturing and machinery industry and is already testing IoT and creating security standards for IoT devices. They go on to say that, quote, bilateral engagement on 5G and IoT standards could be elevated to discussions with the Federal Communications Commission, National Security Council, and State Department. Last, answers to semiconductors. And again, this will be the last time this happens in this video. I do encourage you to pause the video and see what you can come up with. First, on security. At least 7 Taiwanese chip firms have already been targeted by Chinese attacks. Glasser, Bush, and Green 20. The number could be higher, and how successful these attacks are may also not be clear. It's great that Taiwan has dedication to technology security, but given the constant assaults from China, this should be a major concern to any country seeking a long-term tech partnership with Taiwan. Next, supply. TSMC, Taiwan's largest and most important chip manufacturer, is currently building factories in Japan and the US. Its Arizona plant, scheduled to begin production in 2024, will make 4 and 5 nanometer chips, the world's most advanced. It's Tyson 22. In other words, whatever fate befalls the island of Taiwan, the US's chip supply is already secure. Next for pro, geopolitics. The geopolitical value of Taiwan to both the US and China, and the military strategic importance of Taiwan to China, cannot be overstressed. Any dealings of the US with Taiwan, therefore, have an outsized impact on international relations. This BTA is, of course, no exception. And in addition to the economic and tech benefits the US could reap, the geopolitical gains of such an agreement are significant. Given this importance, Anthony Kim makes it clear what the US needs to do. Quote, "It's in the interest of America to follow through on Taiwan's desire to enter into negotiations for a free trade and investment agreement. The US-Taiwan relationship is one worth investing in further over the next decade. The practical, more institutionalized economic partnership represented by a free trade agreement would reinforce other vital diplomatic links between the two longtime partners." So, what impacts might these have? First, independence. Make no mistake, China wants Taiwan, and taking Taiwan by any means necessary is likely China's main foreign policy objective in the short and medium time frame. Economic coercion is one of China's main weapons in this effort, and as Taiwan's main trading partner, China has a lot of leverage on this small island. The U.S. is the only player that can keep China from achieving its goal, and a BTA is a strong sign of the U.S.'s sustained and increasing support. Taiwan's ongoing exclusion from the rest of the international world as a country and an equal trading partner, at China's behest, of course, deepens Taiwan's dependence on China. From Deprez 16, and this quote is edited for length, quote, "Because the vast majority of major nations do not recognize the ROC's sovereignty, Taiwan is often unable to become a part of major FTAs that in the 21st century have grown increasingly important for other nations. This region-based trade integration, particularly fast in Asia, has left Taiwan unable to capitalize on globalization. Instead, Taiwan has been forced to increase its reliance on China for commerce. The long-term hope of the PRC, of China, is that once economic dominance over Taiwan is complete, the island nation will peacefully and voluntarily rejoin the mainland. If Taiwan finds itself unable to join a trade pact, the economic forces driving Taiwan's drift towards China may be mitigated. And in fact, end quote. And in fact, China's strategy may win out without a BTA. This is from Danielson 20, quote, "If Taiwan is unable to strengthen its other trade relationships, it may be obligated to lean further towards China. This is not in the United States' interest, and a BTA would help deepen Taiwan's move away from China's economic orbit." Duesterberg, 21, minces no words in his essay in Forbes. Quote, "The United States should quickly accept the offer of Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen to enter into negotiations for a free trade agreement." An added benefit of a BTA between the two countries is that it sets a precedent for other countries. In the best case, this could lead to a snowball effect of other countries signing agreements with Taiwan and opening Taiwan up more fully to the international community. These benefits are completely independent from any economic gains to the US itself or to Taiwan from the BTA. From Time magazine, quote, "While much of Taiwan's exports to the US are already tariff-free, an agreement with Washington might provide political cover for similar deals with nations that want to boost ties but are wary of a backlash from China." That's Lee 20. Nope. That is Time magazine. The FTA won't only give strategic benefits to the US, but moral benefits as well, as the US helps to uphold, through Taiwan, key Western ideals celebrated by the free world at large. For example, trade liberalization. In an interview, Ma Ying-jeou, former president of Taiwan, talked about how the country might further liberalize its trade policies. And again, this quote is edited for clarity. Quote, an FTA type of agreement could really contribute to the enhancement of trade relations. If we had one, I think we could do even better. It's Paul et al., 17. Or democracy. With China's constant propaganda, economic pressure, and its more insidious practices that erode Taiwanese democracy, the island may quickly succumb if not for the help of the US. Here's Blanchard and Lee 21, quoting a letter written by a bipartisan group of 42 senators in support of a US-Taiwan BTA. Quote, maintaining U.S. economic influence in the region and reducing Taiwan's dependence on China is essential to ensuring that the region remains free and open, the letter said. For Pro, let's touch briefly on solvency. If we wanted to, could we really make this BTA happen? Here's 3 reasons that we can. First, there's precedent. Taiwan already has free trade deals with New Zealand and Singapore. Joining 2 of its allies in support for a third doesn't seem like a stretch for the US. Here's an interesting side note. Taiwan also has a free trade agreement with China, the ECFA. Second, the US does want to join. Smith et al. 22, for example, cites a letter from 150 members of the House of Representatives in support of the agreement, written to former President Trump's trade representative. Third, Taiwan shares the same motivation and has openly asked the US to start negotiations over the deal. Despite the domestic difficulties in Taiwan, a BTA could cut into Taiwanese agricultural profits and may require a number of reforms to achieve the US's high standards for its trading partners, as well as international difficulties. China. The government of President Tsai Ing-wen believes the deal is important enough to make it a top priority. That's Blumenthal and Maza 19. Next, on to Khan. Again, let's start conservatively with the most direct link to the topic, economics. Not only would a BTA fail to provide the economic benefits that Pro touts, it may actually lead to economic harms. And in regards to economics, we have many specific reasons that this BTA would be bad for the US, potentially also for Taiwan. First, China. One of the biggest economic reasons not to go through with a BTA is the retaliation that would certainly follow from China. With China representing 26% of Taiwan's trade and 18% of US trade, China has massive economic leverage against both countries. But even assuming China wouldn't retaliate, for example, for fear of worsening the trade war or fear of hurting its own economy, the US would pay a massive opportunity cost for penning the deal with Taiwan. From McDaniel and Zhang 21, quote, a US-China FTA is estimated to generate gains of 1.2% of US GDP, 500 times the gains of an agreement with Taiwan, and over 3 times the gains of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. So, when combined with the fact that a US-Taiwan FTA would almost certainly rule out a US-China FTA, the AF becomes even more foolhardy. China aside, Taiwan is a bad trading partner. It's foolish to enter into trade agreements with countries that will be difficult to work with. If we want to show support for Taiwan, there are certainly better ways to do it. First, protectionism. Taiwan has been accused of being protectionist by valuing domestic industries over foreign ones. And while many countries do this, like China, it's not a good basis for free US-Taiwan relations. Here's Packer 19, quote, the United States does have some legitimate complaints about Taiwanese protectionism. The tiny island is too protectionist in its agricultural markets, particularly pork and beef, and is increasingly hostile to investment by U.S. multinational corporations. Locked in a regulatory dispute that looks an awful lot like disguised protectionism, transportation network companies are currently struggling to maintain market access in Taiwan. Walters 20 also notes that Taiwan has been accused of tampering with exchange rates, thus potentially running afoul of the U.S. Treasury Department. In addition, Taiwan's banking system is severely underdeveloped. The first time I walked into a Taiwanese bank, I honestly felt like I was stepping back in time into a 1990s movie with minimal, outdated, yellowed computers, printers and papers everywhere, almost everything done by hand, and this open floor plan with minimal security. In fact, businesses and investors from all over the world have often found it difficult to work with Taiwan, given, quote, a banking sector that operates on too informal a basis and limited options for raising capital outside banks. Several years later, the financial sector continues to fall short of expectations for an advanced economy like Taiwan's. That's Blumenthal and Mazza 19. Unfortunately, there's no amount of goodwill that will fix Taiwan's banking system. And entering into a BTA with a country trapped in the 90s is not a recipe for success. As we mentioned in the pro section, Taiwan is much smaller than the US by every measure. Again, its economy is 34 times smaller than the US. There are 6 US states that by themselves are larger than Taiwan's economy. In short, even if all trade barriers were eliminated overnight, it just wouldn't do much to help the US economy. The US International Trade Commission quantified in a report this year that a BTA would only increase US exports to Taiwan by 16% and imports by 18%. Now, this isn't a bad thing, but it's simply insignificant compared to the massive economic and political costs the US would have to pay. Next, agriculture. The agricultural sector of both the US and Taiwan might suffer with the BTA. The US industry might suffer due to Chinese retaliation. So we have Bill Thompson, a senior agricultural industry writer, writing that, quote, China, the largest export market for US soybeans, is dead set against any talk about the US and Taiwan forging a closer alliance. He goes on to say that while the U.S. ag sector is largely in favor of any new free trade agreement that would do away with tariff and non-tariff barriers and open up new access for U.S. farm goods, the prospect of further antagonizing China is unnerving. Again, that's Thompson 20. Another side note, China is also the largest buyer of U.S. corn and a major buyer of many other agricultural products. But it's not just U.S. farmers. Taiwanese farmers would suffer as well. Nakamura and Hoyama 21 say that, quote, Taiwan's small farmers would surely suffer a major impact, end quote. So much so that Lavin 22, the former ambassador to Singapore, proposes a model where Taiwanese farmers simply sell their land to the government when they are inevitably left unable to compete with cheap U.S. agricultural products. Lastly, free trade is bad. Again, moving away from the specifics of U.S.-Taiwan trade, free trade, which often is heralded as a bringer of peace and stability and wealth, and may have some benefits, has downsides as well. The failure to discriminate against products means that issues of safety, national security, labor rights, and especially more pressing now, we see some moves from the EU to limit things along this line. The environment, like how carbon intensive certain products are these concerns are simply ignored. That's Alden 21. And by signing a BTA with Taiwan, the U.S. may be signing away its rights to discriminate on these crucial terms. Indeed, for this reason, Washington is moving away from free trade in general and instead shifting to a model where trade is used as a diplomatic tool, much as it has been used traditionally to further the interests of the U.S. From Swanson 21, quote, Ms. Tsai, that's the current U.S. trade representative, emphasized that she would help usher in a break with past policies that would, quote, pit one of our segments of our workers and our economy against another, end quote, end quote. That's it for economics. This middle contention of Khan is the highest magnitude for the topic, yet the most scant on evidence. Building out this contention may take some work for Khan, but the huge punch you pack with a nuclear war contention may be worth it to many teams. The gist is this. The US and China may be bound for war. It may be inevitable as rising powers, China, often war with established powers, the US, in a bid to establish a new world order that better advantages them. Ray Dalio illustrates this idea in detail in a 44-minute animated presentation called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. I recommend it to all of you. It is 44 minutes long, but I've linked it below. Every debater should watch it at some point. The difference in magnitude between previous shifts in world order have been essentially one of technology. So World War I was by a long shot the biggest war ever fought. That is, until 20 years later. A non-nuclear World War III may put both of those to shame. And a nuclear war, well, you're familiar with that. And although although China's nuclear arsenal is far smaller than that of the US's, its 350 warheads, that number is rapidly growing, are enough to decimate the US in mere hours. Again, this is the biggest impact of the debate. Tensions are now high between the US and China. Trade relations, intellectual property theft, human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and beyond, censorship, the South China Sea, and probably most importantly, Taiwan. Each country ratchets up tensions with the other on all of these fronts, although by the numbers, the US is far more to blame than China, and China much more balanced. But military escalation by the US pretty much everywhere, and by China in constant air sorties around Taiwan, demonstrate that these tensions could erupt into something bigger. And neither side will back down. As we've said, Taiwan is important to China in terms of history, revenge, pride, internal politics, geostrategy, and more. And although it makes less sense for the US to protect Taiwan, US rhetoric, political visits, and arms sales are at an all-time high. Both sides are escalating. Neither side is backing down. What does any of this have to do with the BTA? Simply this. It's a major move by the US on increasing its support for Taiwan. And with a global nuclear holocaust on the line, nothing, no economic gain, no technological advantage, no moral thoughts about democracy or independence or free markets could possibly merit adding weight to this scale, especially one as hefty as a BTA. And make no mistake, a BTA would anger China. Here's just a few quotes. Blanchard and Lee, 21. Many countries are wary of signing trade deals with the tech powerhouse, fearing objections from China. Thompson, 20. The prospect of further antagonizing China is unnerving. Nikkei Asia. China, which claims Taiwan as its own territory, has condemned the U.S. Indo-Pacific push. Smith et al. 22. The deal would also hurt the deal would also hurt the Chinese economy. U.S. exports to China would decrease in nearly all sectors. China's total trade volume would decrease by just over $1 billion, and China's GDP would be negatively impacted. Again, despite the power of this argument, I don't have cards cut for it. Essentially, I haven't found authors who will make the link directly between a trade agreement and war. So you'll have to make that link. If you do want to run it, you're on your own. But again, the highest possible magnitude of the round is certainly enticing. Next, let's talk about some technical ways, not tech like high-tech semiconductors, but some technical ways like text debate that Khan could win. I've been several times criticized for encouraging running counterplans in PF, so I won't encourage you to do so. If you have any questions about whether you should or should not run a particular case, definitely get feedback from your coach, from teammates, about what would be appropriate in your circuit before running anything that might seem counterplanny. Even in more strict circuits, though, there are certainly ways to present alternatives and models to just illustrate that better worlds exist than what the AF defends, and, of course, to say that these worlds would not be possible with the AF. For this topic, any trade agreement that's not comprehensive or not bilateral could do. In particular, many multilateral agreements already exist or have been proposed or are being proposed that the U.S.-Taiwan economic link could much better fit into. Again, Frank Lavin, he goes on to ask, why not launch FTA talks and TPP talks simultaneously? So he's suggesting combining the now defunct TPP agreement between 12 Pacific Rim countries, including the U.S., and bringing Taiwan into the deal. This would avoid many of the disadvantages to a BTA by allowing the alliance to act in unison against China, rather than pitting the U.S. into ever closer competition with China. So, TPP is one alternative. Many may be out there. And uniqueness. Another relatively small but impactful way that Khan can gain an edge through technicalities. Khan has an excellent case, in fact, to make for a lack of uniqueness on any economic arguments that Pro might run. Trade barriers between the U.S. and Taiwan are already low, so a new agreement would do little to help. For McDaniel and Zhang 21, quote, the overall gains are small because trade barriers are already low, and most of the possible gains from trade with Taiwan have already accrued, following each country's lowering of barriers in earlier years. And to make matters worse, given that Taiwan's economy is 34 times smaller than the U.S., even a drastic increase in trade will do little to help the U.S. economy. This uniqueness argument could be applied to likely most of Pro's arguments, so in terms of increasing diplomacy or links between the U.S. and Taiwan, again, they are now at an all-time high. Increasing defense, it's all-time high. For increasing U.S. Power, control, hegemony over the Indo-Pacific. Again, most countries in the Indo-Pacific are already U.S. allies. So this should be a go-to defense for Khan. All right, we are done. Only 47 minutes. Make sure to comment on the video. Make sure to be kind to each other. Make sure to treat yourself right. Congratulations to the graduates this year. It's a big accomplishment, at least a big milestone, even if not an accomplishment. Best of luck to those of you moving on to other activities. I hope debate has treated you well. And for most of you, I'm excited to see you back here next year. I wish you all a great national topic and a beautiful summer. Bye-bye.